while. Just to be clear about the idea with the tour, to give you some background to this place, looking into why these buildings are here, what are some things that happened here, and what's in them now. The plan is not, however, to take you into every building, but you'll have an idea what's there and you can check it out. We are offering a musket firing demonstration at 1:30, so there will not be one after this tour, but there'll be one in about an hour and a half if you're here for that. Was anyone here for the one earlier? No? Oh, you were. Okay. Just one person. Yeah, so this is one of the 10 City of Toronto run Toronto history museums, different historic sites around town. All of these city-run Toronto history museums are free, so it's not just free for doors open, it's free all the time, although we do have sometimes some ticketed events. Anyone been here before? Long time ago? Does it look different? There might be a couple more buildings around here on the outside, but yeah. Anyone want to share any initial impressions? Go ahead.
The mess hall rules I found interesting. It stuck with me.
Okay. Oh, you mean from before?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Because I don't think we have that posted anywhere, but what was it that you found interesting about it, if I may ask?
Well, when we gather as a family, it's quite noisy around the dinner table.
Sure.
Whereas in the mess hall here, we learned that you don't talk about certain things during the meal,
Right. Yeah.
back then.
我覺得佢同佛座措辭
Yes, they had many. Okay, so let's just backtrack a little bit so people know what we're talking about. When we're talking about the mess, we're talking basically about the private club for the officers. Almost all of that building is set up as the officers' mess. So there's a dining room in there. We have people working in the kitchen at the back. And we have 2 rooms that are restored as a captain's apartment. But the idea of the officers coming together and sharing a meal at the end of the day was important. But it's also, when you think about, a lot of these officers were young men, single, peacetime here. They have money and free time, so they want to make the best of it. But it's also a bit like a frat house atmosphere. So they have rules like you can't speak 3 consecutive words of Latin, otherwise you'll have to buy a bottle to share with everybody. Different kind of rules like that. Or don't talk about religion or politics and things like that. So the idea was that this would create a sense of camaraderie, and so they don't want to dwell on the things that might pull them apart, but focus on coming together with a sense of esprit de corps, as they say. I think if I was coming here for the first time, I would look around and think that these are not very impressive fortifications. I don't know if anyone had that feeling. I'm sorry?
Kind of at first, with just the hills kind of blocking it off. But...
Yeah. So the fortifications here are low, thick, turf-covered earthen ramparts. And the stonework that you see here now dates from the 1930s when the walls were being restored. The original earthen ramparts had wood along the inside, so perhaps even less impressive than they are now. These fortifications were built quickly and cheaply during the War of 1812, but they didn't really have the need or the budget to improve them later on. The British did invest in fortifications at Kingston. Has anyone been to Fort Henry at Kingston? It's a much more impressive fortification than this one. And that's because when these buildings were built, the buildings you see around here now were built during the War of 1812, in the years 1813, 14, and then just after the War of 1812 and 1815, built here by the British Army. At that time, Toronto was called York. It was 2 kilometers east of here, and it had 700 people living in it. So it's hard to maybe imagine Toronto as a village of 700 people at that time. Kingston, at the far end of Lake Ontario, was a bigger town, an older town. It was a former French settlement. It was the main British naval base on Lake Ontario, and it had about 2,500 people. The fortifications that are there now date from the 1830s, and at that point, Kingston was also the bottom end of the Rideau Canal system, which was an important supply route. So they did invest a lot more in the fortifications here. Officers who were here later had plans to kind of improve the fort, but as I said, they never really had the need to do it or the budget to do it. Anyone else want to share a quick initial impression of this place?
lot of wide open fields.
Yeah. So the buildings we have here now, we have 8 buildings total on site. 7 are considered original. They all have some original material. They're all on their original sites.
咁啊好過 Fort
The
George
one-story white wooden building
Fort George
has
係
been
一個
substantially
regional
rebuilt. The Far Brick building, both of those buildings actually date to 1814. The Far Brick building had a second floor and windows added later. Not everything on these buildings obviously goes back to the time when they were built. For example, that 2-story building in the middle of the fort, that dates from 1813. It recently received, earlier this year, brand new cedar shingles up on top. The weatherboarding, some of it was replaced, and it was painted. So it looks, for its age, it looks relatively
一定要
new.
修復啊冇計。
But the buildings that we have here now are part of the 3rd version of a British garrison on this site, and they are less than half of the buildings that would have been here at that time. So some of the spaces that are here would have been taken up with other buildings. And so we have a copy here of a map from 1816, which shows this version of the fort just after the War of 1812. There's a larger version of this map in that middle room there, where there's also an introductory exhibit and a 10-minute introductory video. But yes, there were many more buildings here. For example, over there, where there's a picturesque little awning and someone sitting near the fire pit there was a 2-story brick residence for the fort's commander. That's that building there. Used to be a guardhouse near the east gate. There were some smaller buildings for specialized soldiers like engineers. There were wooden barracks and a cookhouse for soldiers all along the south wall. So there would have been more buildings here at that point.
Makes sense.
So a couple of quick things maybe, hopefully, about this place. One, why are these buildings here? Some of you may know that this was high ground at the entrance to the Toronto Harbour. So the various versions of the British garrison were built here to guard the entrance into the Toronto Harbour. It is really hard to imagine that now. We're surrounded by taller structures, and there's about 500 meters or more in some cases of land south of here that was filled in later. So if you look at this map, there's the shoreline of Lake Ontario just past the south wall. So right about where the first pillar of the Gardiner Expressway is there would have been a 4-meter drop, a little bluff, and then Lake Ontario. There used to be a ravine behind here. It's been integrated into the city's sewer system in the late 19th century. It was originally the largest creek system that emptied out into the Toronto Harbour. So this was literally a piece of triangular high ground right at the entrance to the Toronto Harbour. So if we were here even in the 1850s or 60s, looking that way, we'd be looking at Lake Ontario. Looking that way, we'd be looking across the harbour entrance. What we now know as the Toronto Islands, that geographical formation was originally a peninsula, and you can see that on some of these old maps as well. So the original harbor entrance was about 1,400 meters across, and it would have been basically just right there. The western gap now, with the filling in from this side and from the island side, where the island airport is, for example, that western gap now is 121 meters. So that gives you an idea of how much of that has been filled in. If you've been to the island airport, if you take the ferry, it's a very quick ferry ride to get there. You can also get there walking through a tunnel underneath to get there. So in order to kind of visualize what was going on here, especially when we're going to talk a little bit about the battle that was fought here, we kind of have to see past what's here now to get a sense of not only the geography, but also the buildings that used to be here. So beginning in the late 1850s, that's when they started to fill in the lake, and by 1858, that's when storms blew open a sandy kind of spit that created the island formation out of the peninsula there. But this was considered a harbor defense even into the 1880s, and it was improved as a harbor defense by the British in the 1860s when they brought cannons like the one that's on the ground over there. That and 6 other similar guns were brought here, and openings were made along the south wall for gun positions. So that improved the harbor defense aspect at that point. So high ground at the harbor entrance, hard to imagine now, but that's why these buildings are here. The other thing is that this version of the fort and what's left of it here now, this was built here after the battle that was fought here on April 27th, 1813. And there's more about the battle in the middle room here. There's more about the background to the War of 1812 as well. And the background to the first version of a British garrison here, which was back in 1793. So there have been actually 3 versions of a British garrison on this site. The first one was 1793 to 1800, wooden buildings back in that area there. Wooden buildings did not do well here over time, so they fell into disrepair and were replaced by about 1800 with other wooden buildings that were actually on the other side of the ravine. So the fort that was attacked on the morning of April 27th, 1813, had buildings similar to the white buildings we have here now, but further east on the other side of the ravine. All of the buildings you see here now would not have been here at that time. In the middle of this space over there, the green space, that's where the government house was, the official residence of the British Lieutenant Governor. The well was here since 1802, although it's been restored, so that's not the original housing. And by 1812, actually the ditch and wall along that side had been added. And what that did was create a human-made obstacle there to kind of complete the triangle that had a lake and a little bluff there, and a creek and a ravine back here. So the second version of the garrison was attacked by U.S. soldiers during the War of 1812. The main reason the U.S. captured this area at that time is because they outnumbered the defenders. There's more information, as I said, about the battle in there, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. Basically, the U.S. landed, let's say, a force of about 2,000 or so, 2 kilometers east of here. The outnumbered defenders are about 800 people under arms to defend this area. Half were local militia. There was a force of about 100 or so, mostly Anishinaabeg warriors, Mississauga, Ojibwe, Chippewa people, allies with the British, and there were maybe 350, 400 or so British regular soldiers. So they tried to hold back this larger U.S. force, but eventually the British decided they were going to retreat to Kingston. The town surrendered to the United States. The indigenous allies withdrew into the woods north of here. On the way out, though, the British burned a ship they were building in the harbor so the U.S. wouldn't get it. They also, some of you may know what they did at the end of the battle.
Expose?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
That's right, yeah. The British blew up their gunpowder magazine.
Yeah, 爆咗.
There was a huge explosion here
當年嘅原子彈.
around 1 o'clock on April 27th, 1813. We don't know much about what that gunpowder magazine was like. We know where it was because the crater left from the explosion shows up on the map from 3 years later. So that's feature D there, and what it says, again, there's a larger version of that map in there. It says that's the excavation made by the blowing up of the temporary magazine during the attack on York made by the Americans in 1813. So where would that be now? That crater is not visible now, but where that would have been past the south wall, between the well and the tree, down close to where the shoreline was. So what we know about the explosion from people who experienced it is that it was incredibly dramatic and traumatic. The temporary magazine, whatever it was like, was sunk down into the ground, so the explosion went up and kind of fanned out. People in the town 2 kilometers east of here, they heard it, they saw it, they felt it. Also across Lake Ontario, this way, the mouth of the Niagara River, at places there, including like the British military headquarters at Fort George, they were aware of this big explosion as well. Debris fell in a 200-meter radius around here. Some of it fell on the decks of U.S. ships that were out just by the harbor entrance there. Some into the ravine here, some local militia. There were actually a few, very few casualties among the defenders. Most of the debris fell on the U.S. troops that were out that way. about to attack this area. And according to their army report, 38 of them were killed right away. Another 222 were wounded, some of whom died later, including Brigadier General Zebulon Pike. He was badly wounded and died after the battle. Despite all that, though, the U.S. forces did capture this area. They stayed a week. During the time that they were here in 1813, they burned what was left of the fort after the British had blown up part of it. They burned the Parliament building in the town. There was some other burning and looting that went on, but then they all got back on their ships and went off to attack some other places. Now, they did plan to come back here later. That didn't work out, and so the British came back here in the middle of August 1813 and began to build a new fort. And so the buildings we have here now are what is left of that version of the fort. So these are some of Toronto's oldest buildings from 1813, 14, 15. Also Canada's largest grouping of surviving military buildings from the time of the War of 1812. They are less than half the buildings shown on this map, as I think we were talking about a bit earlier. So the oldest ones are the two-story white buildings. The one we're going to actually end up our little tour in that middle one, so you get an idea of what's in there. There's actually a big exhibit in there about the British Army during their time here from 1793 to 1870. So the two blockhouses date from 1813. The far one that you can't see is locked and used for storage. The two buildings that way that date from 1814 also have some exhibits in it. With the tour, we're not planning to go in there, but there are definitely some things to see there. These buildings all at this end date from 1815. That includes a gunpowder magazine there, and I'm hoping to take you guys over there in just a moment. We have washrooms here. These two 1815 barracks buildings were for soldiers and their families. There is a back room here restored as a barracks room from around the time when this building was new in 1815. And at various points during the day, some of the reenactors who are here, I believe, are going to be animating in that space. Plus, we have the officers' quarters from 1815. I already mentioned, I think, that there are people in the kitchen there, so you can check that out and talk with those people. One of the themes for Doors Open this year is hidden histories. We have a lot of hidden histories here. There are many layers of history and meaning here. But we do have some signs that were just put in because of the basement kitchen there. We actually have in the basement here the oldest surviving purpose-built kitchen in Toronto. It dates from 1815. We're not using it now, but if you go into the basement there, you can see the cooking hearth, the bake oven. You can also see where they later put in a wine cellar, and there's some money vaults down there. So actually, it's a pretty interesting basement. So I would encourage you to check that out as well. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea, maybe, of the context for these buildings, and a little bit about the battle, and a little bit about what you can find in these buildings today. Any thoughts, comments, questions? Well, it really depends on when you come here. So the original idea with these buildings was to have up to 32 people in each of the rooms sharing bunks, including potentially 4 families in each of those rooms. If you take that out through the rest of the buildings, I mean, there were rules about how many families could come with the soldiers, and it would depend on how big the garrison was. But there could have been, well, even in just this building alone, 12 families, another 12 over there, possibly some more in the wooden barracks, and also on the top floor there.